Tell us, am I on track to retire?
Thanks, Carrie. I'm Rick Miller. As Carrie said, founder and CEO of Sensible Financial. We're fee-only advisors. If you'd like to learn more about us, please check out our website, www.sensiblefinancial.com. And again, just to reiterate what Carrie suggested, if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. Thank you for joining us, and let's begin. This is the fourth of 4 webinars, and we've covered a lot of ground. The topics or the conclusions that we have come to or will come to when we complete today's webinar include, first, you have an implicit retirement plan. We covered that in the first week. Your financial activity to date implies a retirement plan, and changes to that plan require conscious action. You can retire once your assets will fund your post-retirement spending. And we covered that last week, and we'll also look at that again today. And your assets, for this purpose, include your Social Security benefits. And calculating those and including them as an asset is a very important component of building a financial plan. You can calculate the assets you need to fund a year of retirement. That's your number. And we talked in the second webinar about how to do that. Social Security is a guarantee, is your primary source of guaranteed lifetime income. It's a very important resource, and it behooves you to get the most out of it you can. And finally, as we'll talk about today, longer lifespans require later retirement, lower spending, or both. And we'll spend a good deal of time on that. Let's get to today's topics. How can you tell if you're on track? And what difference does it make how long I live? Wouldn't it be great to have a simple way to know you're on track to retire? You could think of financial progress indicators. You could think of getting promotions, having your salary grow. You could think of living within your means, paying off your credit cards each month. I call that good financial hygiene. You can think of basic or targeted retirement preparation, maxing out your retirement plan contributions, growing your savings, increasing your home equity. All of those are good signs, but unfortunately, none of them really works to tell you if you're on track to retire. They're all snapshots of what's going on right now. But to address whether you're on track, you have to look into the future, and you'll have to look far into the future. You have to look to the end of retirement. And that requires more than just a snapshot. While you're working, you can live in the now. At the extreme, you can live paycheck to paycheck, but you also have influence over your financial circumstances. You can work more hours. You can look for a higher paying job. You can't do either of those things after you retire. You can also choose how much to spend. And your lifestyle or your living standard has implications both for how much you need to spend now, but also the future resources you'll require to continue to live at that living standard after you retire. Your lifestyle is easy to increase. It's easy to get accustomed to spending a lot of money. It's not so easy to cut back if you've gotten used to spending a lot. Now, at the extreme, you can think of, while you're working, spending a lot and not saving a lot, and that means that your retirement spending will be drastically lower after you retire. You could think of not spending much, and then you'll have a lot of resources, and you'll, in effect, risk under living now, right? You'll look back and say, well, I could have had more fun. Ideally, your spending while you're working and your spending after you retire will match. And the trick is to figure out how to make that happen. Now, the simple answer to telling whether you're on track to retire is to look at your lifetime balance sheet. And constructing the lifetime balance sheet requires a lifetime financial plan so that you can add up all of your resources, first of all. And those resources include your Social Security benefits, your future earnings from now through the time you retire, your savings that are in taxable accounts, and your retirement savings. You also have to know what you plan to spend. And those categories of spending include housing expenses, insurance premiums, taxes, special expenses like big vacations or college education for your kids. And then finally, you want to know about how much you're planning to spend on discretionary items. And if, when you add everything up, all your resources minus those predictable or committed expenses and minus your future discretionary spending leaves a surplus, then you're on track. You're in good shape. Now, you can do this at any time. You can construct a lifetime balance sheet, and we'll talk in a minute about how to do that. I think it's important to recognize that it's impossible to be precise with this because we're planning for a very long time. But still, the more care you take, the more confidence you can have. Did you get the taxes right when you were thinking about future taxes? Do you have a good estimate of future taxes? Are you relying on big stock market growth? Relying too much on that means that you may be overconfident about your ability or your being on track to retire. Are you taking inflation into account? And are you planning for healthcare expenses? Are you thinking about long-term care expenses? So all of those are factors that you want to take into account when you're building a lifetime balance sheet. And we'll talk now a little bit more about how to do that. And we're going to go back to, I'm calling them our heroes, Tina and Steve Yall. These are the couple, or this is the couple that we work with throughout the webinar series. So let's bring them back one more time and just remind ourselves about who they are and what their financial circumstances are. So their earnings are here, and I chose their earnings so that they were approximately at 60% and 30% of the Social Security wage base. And that wage base is the most, or the maximum earnings that you pay FICA taxes on, Social Security taxes on. And this year, that's $137,700. They've accumulated about, or almost $500,000 in assets, about $450,000. Their discretionary spending is, I've said, as much as they can afford, and they've chosen $38,000 a year. They pay rent, they pay taxes, which aren't shown here. They're planning to live to be 100, and we'll talk about why that's important. And they plan to start their Social Security benefits at 70. And then the economic assumptions we make are also important. And we've made assumptions about how Social Security benefits will change. You may have heard that Social Security will run out of money. And what that means is that the taxes that will be collected will be less than the benefits that will be paid out. And that will happen, that will hit with full force in about 2035. And at that point, we've assumed that Congress will split the difference, will split the shortfall between beneficiaries and taxpayers. And that means that benefits will be reduced by about 11%, taxes will increase by about 12%, and that's not 12 percentage points, that's from 12.4% to 13.8%. And we have here also real rate of return of about 0.5%, inflation of about 2%. So, given those assumptions, how could the Yalls see if they're on track? How can you see if you're on track? And you have to start with a plan. You have to be able to say something about what you will need to have once you retire. And that means we need information about your income, your assets, your Social Security earnings history, because that will tell us about what your Social Security benefits will be, your retirement plans, the money you put in, the contributions from your employer, and reasonable assumptions about taxes and rates of return and inflation. And then you build a lifetime balance sheet. And you can do that with software. We use a piece of software called Maxify, which is very good, but you don't have to use Maxify. You can use a paper and pencil. You can use a spreadsheet. Using a paper and pencil and using a spreadsheet require you to make assumptions about taxes and rates of return that are you may be uncomfortable making. And it'll require you to make calculations that you may be uncomfortable making. But doing something, building some sort of plan is much better than not having anything. And it will give you a sense of both what your resources are now and what they will be in retirement. And you can do this every year. You can do it every few years. The closer you are to retirement, I think the more frequently you'd like to do that to get a sense of where you are. But it's important to have some sense of what you're going to need to spend once you retire. And you want to plan for your living standard, your spending, not to drop much after you retire. So you can tell if you're on track with this plan that I'm suggesting that you would want to build, or with the lifetime balance sheet that you should build, if the discretionary spending you can afford after you retire is more or less the same as the discretionary spending that you can afford now. And on the other hand, if you've built that lifetime balance sheet, you should have surplus. You should have extra to give you comfort that you have the ability to sustain a negative contingency or two. So that's if you have a plan, if you're looking at a plan. If you built a plan last year, 2-3 years ago, that plan would have in it, or implicit in it, a growth rate for assets. And you can look at where your assets are relative to what your plan said they should be and check to see if they match. So this is kind of theoretical. Let's look at it, what it looks like in practice. So for the Yalls, we built, in effect, 4 plans. We built one where they retire at 55, one where they retire at 60, one where they retire at 65, and one where they retire at 70. And we know that they're now spending $38,000 a year. The plan that they build for retiring at 55, when they're 55, in effect, they're saying, suppose we quit now. That says they could spend $15,000 a year, every year, on discretionary spending. And they're now spending 38. So they're way short. Their living standard would drop a lot. And so we would say, not really on track to retire at this point. Suppose they said, well, we could retire at 60. Then they could afford $27,000 a year now through the end of retirement. Still below what they're spending now. So still not really on track, because when people say that they want to be on track to retire, they mean they'd like their living standard to be the one that they're accustomed to, which is the one they're living now. Planning to retire at 65, they can afford to spend $38,000. They're spending $38,000. They're on track. And if they said, well, we're really thinking about retiring at 70, then they're going to have extra every year. And that extra every year is the same as surplus, right? It's money that they don't need to support their current living standard. And here they'd have surplus of about $10,000 or $11,000 a year every year from 70 through 100. You know, $300,000, $350,000, something like that. Now, you could also suppose that the Yalls had built a plan at 55, and now they're 60, and they want to see if they're on track. And implicit in that plan was growth in assets, growth in taxable assets, growth in Steve's retirement assets, and growth in Tina's assets, retirement assets. And after they've adjusted for inflation, they'd want to see if their taxable assets are about 400, because that's what the plan was forecasting that they would need. And their retirement assets should be about 250, about the difference between 400 and 650. And it's important here to say that it's not just the total that matters, It's also the composition. So if they had, let's say, 200,000 in taxable assets and 450,000 in tax deferred or retirement assets, that wouldn't be as good, because those tax deferred assets are pre-tax, taxes owed. And so the plan figured in the taxes on this 250,000. It didn't figure in taxes on more. So if they had 650, but it was much more retirement assets and much less taxable assets or after-tax assets, that wouldn't be quite as good. Now, we're not looking for the numbers to be exactly the same. That it would be nice if they were, but plans usually aren't that accurate. But we want to be in the ballpark. We'd like to be, let's say, somewhere between 600 and 700 in total, and somewhere between 350 and 450 in this case. If we're much below, then that says we're probably not on track, and we may want to revise our plan, update our plan. And if we're way above, then we're ahead. We might want to look again and just confirm, maybe we could retire a little bit earlier. Maybe the y'alls could retire a little bit earlier in this case. Well, so that's thinking about being on track. Now, let's think about whether, or the impact of life expectancy. Does it matter how long you live? And can you, if your life expectancy is, let's say, lower, can you plan for not living as long, and could you maybe retire earlier? Here we're going to look at 4 scenarios with different lifespans, and we're going to use lifespan here and not life expectancy. So we're planning to live the full lifespan. We're planning for the y'alls to live to be 100. Here we're planning for them to live to be 90 in scenario 2. In scenario 3 and 4, we're also planning for them to live to be 90. And we're saying we're going to run for each scenario a different retirement date. So for scenario 1, 65, 65 for scenario 2, and then 64 and 63 for scenarios 3 and 4. And what we're trying to determine here is whether a shorter lifespan will allow them to retire earlier. And here's what we find. For the first scenario, we know, because we already did that, it was a scenario that we did earlier, that if they retire at 65, planning to live to be 100, they'll be able to spend $38,000, which is what they're spending now. If their lifespan is 90 and they retire at 65, they'd be able to spend more, $43,000. And that says they'd have a little surplus. And that suggests that they could retire a little bit earlier and still be able to spend $38,000 a year. And in fact, they could. They could retire either at 64 and have a little extra, or at 63 and be just a little bit short. So that 10 years shorter of life expectancy allows them to retire 1 or 2 years earlier. So not a big impact. So let's think about that a little bit. Let's look at another example. Suppose that we have the y'alls again, but suppose that they won the lottery and they had an extra $1 million. They won $1 million at 55 after tax, which is pretty good. I'm not suggesting that should be your retirement plan, but it works out for the y'alls. So now we're looking at 4 scenarios. They're a little different than the 4 scenarios we looked at before, and we have them retiring at 65 with a full lifespan of 100, and they could afford to spend $61,000 a year. And suppose that they've chosen that 61 is what they want to spend now that they're wealthier and they have these extra assets. And then suppose they decide that they get some bad news from the doctor or something like that. They decide that their lifespan is not going to be 100, it's going to be only 90. Then they'd have substantial surplus, $10,000 a year. And that would suggest that they could retire earlier. And here we say, well, suppose they retire at 64, they've still got surplus, a lot. If we have them retire at 61, now their living standard just about matches the 61 that they think they can afford or could afford if they were going to live to be 100. So in this case now, with the extra $1 million, 10 years less life expectancy means that they can retire 4 years earlier, 61 rather than 65. Why is that? Why is it different than in the first case? And the answer is it depends on how important Social Security is in the overall plan. So this is a much simpler example than the y'alls. And we're looking at a situation where the people we're looking at can retire at 65, and they have enough retirement assets. Sorry, they can retire at 65, and they've got enough assets to be able to support the spending level that they want, and these assets plus Social Security benefits will support them through retirement. Now, if they get a shorter lifespan, 10 years shorter, they get 2 years more retirement. And let me go back and say that once they're retired, the Social Security benefits are providing 80% of their required resources, and their assets are supplying only 20. Right? And if they want to retire earlier before their Social Security benefits, then they have to supply everything. So this 20% for 10 years gives them 2 full years here. Okay? All right. So now let's look at a situation where Social Security benefits are much less important. So they're 20% they supply 20% of the resources required after retirement or after Social Security benefits start at 70. And now 80% of the asset or 80% of the resources are supplied by assets. And those 80% over 10 years will give 8 more years here. 8 years. So shorten life expectancy by 10, get 8 more years of retirement. And at the extreme, so there are 2 extremes, if Social Security benefits were all of the resources, supplied all the resources necessary, then having a shorter life expectancy wouldn't allow you to retire any earlier at all. But if you didn't have Social Security benefits and it was all based on assets, then 10 years shorter life expectancy would allow you to retire 10 years earlier. Okay. Now, all that being said, so it sounds like if you want to retire earlier, just assume that you won't live as long. And you could do that. We don't recommend that. It's really tempting to do that, but it's risky. And it's risky for a number of reasons. First of all, it's important to understand that when you think about life expectancy and somebody tells you that your life expectancy, let's say at 65, is the high 80s, that means that that's the middle of the amount of time that you might live. So if we could run your life 100 times, half the time you're going to live longer than life expectancy, and the other half you won't live as long as life expectancy. So there's a big chance you'll live beyond your life expectancy. So you want to think about how long you might plausibly live rather than what life expectancy is. Secondly, people tend to underestimate how long they're going to live, and that's an empirical fact. When surveys are done and ask people how long they expect to live, and then we match that number that people have said with the numbers that an actuary would say. An actuary is somebody who works for an insurance company who predicts how long people will live. People underestimate how long they're going to live. Third, if you forecast how long you're going to live based on how long your parents lived, you're likely to be short again because people are living longer. So it's likely that you'll live longer than your parents did or your parents' generation did. And finally, if you're wrong, your ability to adjust is small. And I like to joke with clients. I say, we can plan for you to live to be 85, but then when you come to us at 85 and you're still in great shape, and you say, well, we spent the money, there's nothing we can do at that point. It's our ability to plan is non-existent. Okay, we will. There are circumstances in which it makes sense to reduce the plan duration or the time horizon for which you're planning. Usually, we're doing that based on medical circumstances. People have an illness that makes it very unlikely that they'll live, or reduces their life expectancy, or makes it very unlikely that they would live to be 100. And then we'll adjust the planning horizon. But otherwise, it's pretty risky to do that. And that concludes the discussion, and we're ready to take questions.
Okay. Oops. There we go. There I am. Rob asks, why is Social Security after 70 in the example you stated? I'm assuming he's saying, why does someone apply for Social Security after 70?
Well, why? It may be, why does Social Security start after 70 in this? And this is I would say typographical error, but it's not. But it's not a word. It's a graphical error. So this Social Security benefit should start at 70 here in this example.
Okay.
So if that's Rob's question, that's the answer. If Rob, if that's not your question, then please restate it, and we'll give it another try.
And just so people know, if you could please put the questions in the Q&A box, that would be the best. Okay, Rick has a question. Let's see. Is there a rule of thumb on the best order of withdrawals taken from tax-free, taxable, and tax-deferred accounts that minimizes taxes? For example, do I take from taxable accounts first, then tax-deferred, then tax-free, or what is the order? And does Maxify or some other software automatically figure that out, or do you have to kind of experiment with it?
So the first thing to say is there is no rule of thumb. Or rather, that the rule of thumb, which you may hear, which is exhaust taxable assets first, and then use tax-deferred assets second, and then use Roth or tax-free assets third, that may work, but that may not be the best approach. Conceptually, what you're trying to do is to maximize the after-tax value of your assets and your draws from your assets. And that means that you want to equalize your marginal income tax rate across your retirement years. So you want that marginal tax rate to be the same every year. And in fact, you'd like it to be the same every year, starting as soon as you can make it happen. So suppose that you're in a situation where you retire at 60, you're planning to draw Social Security at 70, and you're planning to start your IRA and 401k distributions at 72. So, and you're retired at 60, so your income is going to be pretty low then. In that case, you probably want to start taking IRA distributions and take enough IRA distributions so that you can get to the top of the bracket, the marginal tax bracket that you will be in after 72, when you're taking required minimum distributions. And conceptually, that works because suppose that you're, just to make it really simple, suppose you're in the 10% bracket at 60, and after you start your retirement distributions, you're going to be in the 24% bracket. Every dollar that you move from the 24% bracket to the 10% bracket saves you 14 cents of taxes. So you want to move as many dollars as you have to until you get into the 24% bracket at 60. And you can do that usually by doing Roth conversions or just by taking IRA distributions at that time. Alternatively, so suppose that you have a year where suppose you're fully retired, it's after 72, and you're taking your required minimum distributions, and you have a big need, a big expense that comes up, and you say, well, if I take from my IRA account, I'm going to be in a much higher tax bracket. Then it might be a good year to draw from the Roth, right? Because again, you don't want to be paying taxes at 35% if you can wait till next year and pay at 24. So drawing from the Roth will allow you to do that. So that each person's situation is going to be different, and you want to think about the whole. Again, unfortunately, you can't think just about this year. You have to think about the whole lifetime when you're making decisions about how to take the distributions, if you want to be tax efficient.
Okay. Jose has a question. He asks, what is the basis for using 100 as life expectancy as opposed to, say, 105?
That is a really good question. And one could use 105. I think that we've been using 100 since we started the firm in 2002. And as life expectancy has increased, and we chose that because at that time, the odds of anybody living past 100 were pretty small. And we used that number because we wanted to be as sure as we could be that people wouldn't live past that number, past that age. As life expectancy has increased, we can increase it to 101 or 102. There is a certain amount of judgment there, and unfortunately, there's no great way to come up with that number. But I know that, I mean, you can look at actuarial tables and see what are the odds that somebody will live to be 90. And if we're talking about I think these numbers are roughly right. If we're talking about a woman at 65 in good health, there's a 25% chance she's going to live to be 90. And there's a 10% chance she's going to live to be 100. So I'm not happy with 25%. I'm happier with 10%. Maybe not as happy as I should be. And we each year we think about what we're going to use as the time horizon age, and it may be time to adjust it to 101 or 102.
Okay. Well, Kay asks, why is there no tax applied to the after-tax asset bucket? Many times these after-tax assets are held in mutual funds or stocks that grow substantially.
Right, that's true. And then you'd have to account for that. But typically, when we invest, we're investing so that the assets in taxable accounts are invested in assets that are tax advantaged, right? So if you have stocks in the taxable account, then you get tax deferral just by buying and holding. And it is true that taxes will apply to the taxable account, but it's not to to every dollar in the account, it's only to the gains in the account. Whereas with a retirement account, the ordinary income tax is applied to the whole balance in general. Whereas with taxable accounts, especially if they're invested mostly in stocks, taxes are going to capital gains taxes or the preferred rate for dividends are going to apply to only the gain in the account. And if you're getting dividends in the taxable account and reinvesting them, that in effect the reinvestments become part of the basis. So you're right that to be precise, you have to apply a tax rate, but in general, it's going to be a much lower tax rate than would be applied to the tax deferred account.
Okay. Well, Stephen asks, if I use a spreadsheet to plan and the assumptions on growth are linear, should I try to underestimate returns as a worst case scenario?
We use a risk-free rate of return. And in general, that's what I would advise when you're using a spreadsheet, rather than trying to predict what, if you have stocks or if you have a mix of stocks and bonds, making a prediction about what the returns will be is very risky because no one knows what the returns will be. And you'd like to say, well, they'll be at least 2% or they'll be at least 4%, but you don't know that. And what we do know is that you can get the risk-free rate of return, and you can invest that and invest in risk-free assets or very low-risk assets, and you can be quite confident that you'll get that return. So we recommend using that risk-free rate rather than guessing at what the risky rate might be that would be appropriate for your portfolio.
Gary asked a question. How are taxes incorporated into your different analyses? Are they part of the spending or do they reduce the income?
Well, I think the short answer is both. Let's see here. If we look at the lifetime balance sheet, I don't want to go too fast here. Here we are, right? So you see taxes are shown as a type of spending, right? They reduce the resources, but they're not considered to be part of discretionary spending. So you have to include them, but whether you call them a spending or a reduction of resources, if you do it, you want to be sure not to double count them. You want to treat them as one or the other, but and you want to get the timing right? So if you assume that all the taxes come out in 1 year, that may not be, that may give you an incorrect answer because there's accumulation on the assets that won't be accurately captured in the model if you try to do it all in 1 year.
Mm-hmm. Does it make sense to assume discretionary spending needs at 90 are similar to those at 65?
That is a great question. There is a lot of controversy is too strong a word because financial planners are in general pretty mild-mannered people. But there's a lot of discussion about that. And I think there's not a lot of great analysis. I think that the approach that we take tries to recognize that as people get older, the composition of spending may change. So, for example, you may spend less on travel and more on healthcare. You may spend less on travel and more on help. because as people get older, they may be less able to do things for themselves, and they may need help with those things. And so, for that reason, we've kept it level. But there is, I think, scope for discussion there.
Rick says, the current actuarial mortality tables now go to age 120. Do you think that's overkill for retirement planning assumption on longevity?
Well, we'll leave aside the play on words, and actuaries plan to 120 because they're planning for, if you will, all eventualities. The number of people out of 100,000 alive at 120 is 1, I think, or 0, in fact, if they're right. But and at 119, it's 1. I have a colleague or somebody that I know who's works at a Canadian university, and he gives presentations about annuities, and he likes to, I guess he used to like to, I don't know if the Toronto Star still does this, but the Toronto Star, which is the daily paper, or was the daily paper, I don't know if it still is, in Toronto, used to print pictures of the oldest living Canadian. And the age of that person varied. Some years it was 110, some years it was 113, some years it was 115, but even that tells us that it was extreme, right? Because it was the oldest living Canadian. So the vast majority of Canadians had died before that point. So I'm comfortable with a horizon that's well short of 120. But I think there's scope for discussion about whether it should be 100 or 101 or 102 or even 105. But 120, I think, is more than we need.
Okay, Steve has a question. Assuming that your predictions about Social Security are correct, do your calculations allow for a reduction in Social Security benefits after 2035?
Yes, they let's see. Yes, we're assuming benefit reductions of 11% after 2035.
Okay. Another
and the model assumes those. Sorry, Carrie.
Nope, it's quite all right. Okay. Someone asks, what percentage is the risk-free rate?
Right now, the risk-free rate after inflation is, we're using 0.6%. In January, we're probably going to adjust it down to about minus 0.5%. The risk-free rate is the real risk-free rate, the rate of return after inflation. And if you look at government bonds that are inflation protected, that's the rate that we're looking at, unfortunately.
Okay. Someone asks, do you do personal planning and consulting by the hour? Is that how you?
I see. That's a good question. That's a good question. We've decided that we will work on a project basis, and our projects are plans. So we do financial plans as projects, as standalone projects, but we don't generally work by the hour. We found that we found that we just are more effective working on it on a full plan.
The Lasses family asks, if you want your IRA assets to last 30 years, is there a standard percentage you can use each year? For example, if you have, for example, 2 million in your IRA,
Mm-hmm.
how much can you withdraw safely if you want it to last 30 years?
That's right. So, there is, if you're saying, is there a percentage that you can draw every year? The answer is no, right? Because suppose you said, well, we're going to draw. It's sort of like there's a I think it's a famous example of, I want to say it's Hercules and the tortoise. It's probably not Hercules and the tortoise, right? But it's that Hercules is twice as fast as the tortoise, right? It's got to be a really fast tortoise or a really slow Hercules, and so it's Zeno's paradox. Every time we look, Hercules has cut the gap to the tortoise in half, but he never gets to the tortoise because if you break the times down into shorter and shorter intervals, the calculus solves that problem. But if you take, let's say, 10% every year, then you'll always have 90% left of whatever it was. So that's not, I think, a very helpful way to think about it. If you think about the required minimum distributions, they are an increasing percentage over time, and they're designed to draw all the assets, I don't think by 100, but maybe it is by 100. I mean, at a certain age, they want you to draw 50%, and then the next year they want you to draw 100% of the assets. So if you want to apply a percentage, it's got to be an increasing percentage. There is a famous original piece of work by a guy named Bill Bengen, who thought really hard about safe withdrawal rates. And he estimated, or he determined, something called the 4% rule, which was you could draw, if you started with, in this case, as an example, 2 million, you could draw 4% of the 2 million in the first year, so that'd be 80,000, and then you draw 80,000 each year thereafter. And his observation was that if you looked historically, that meant that drawing that way, no one ever ran out, or rather over the, at that point, I think it was 30 or 40 30-year periods he looked at, starting in 1926 and going to 1956, and then 27 to 57, 28 to 58, and so forth, right? That over none of those periods would the person making those draws have run out of money. So that's the basis of the 4% rule. Now, and he worked on how should the money be allocated, and I think this was with a 60-40 portfolio, and that was the one that worked best. The problem with that analysis is that it's still specific to the time periods that we're looking at, or the time periods that he looked at, and there's a lot of overlap in those time periods, right? So 26 to 56 and 27 to 57 share 29 out of 30 years, and so forth. So the number of independent observations there is smaller than you would like to have, and therefore those simple rules are problematic. I would prefer to. I think that the safe thing to do is to say, well, we'll use the IRA RMD rules as our rule for how much we're going to draw, and that's likely to work pretty well. That way, you're going to get a percentage that varies over time, and if that increases over time, so that you don't run into the paradox that I talked about earlier, which is that you never use all the money, but also if you have several bad years in terms of stock returns, if the portfolio is invested in stocks, then you're going to be drawing less in dollar terms, and so the money is going to last. But you're going to accept, if you follow the RMD rules, then you're going to accept fluctuation in the amount that you're drawing, depending upon how the market does. But accepting that fluctuation will allow you to make sure that there's still some left as you get into the later years.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And the person asks, can a person do a Roth conversion if they are not working, but their spouse is working?
You can do a Roth conversion anytime. Anybody can do a Roth. I shouldn't say anybody. People under 21 probably aren't doing Roth conversions, but although I suppose they could. But there are no rules that are that I'm aware of that restrict your ability to do Roth conversions to when you're working or when you're not working. It's just, that's not a criterion for being able to do a Roth conversion. Deciding about how to do a Roth conversion, again, goes back to the question we talked about earlier when we're talking about optimizing or from a tax perspective. You want to, if you're thinking about doing a Roth conversion, you want to think about the value of your assets after tax and whether doing the Roth conversion will help you accomplish that objective.
Okay, so we did actually get one more question. Would you mind answering one more question?
We can do one more, sure.
Okay. This person is living in an expensive West Coast city. So his home value is a significant portion of assets, 25%. Is thinking of going to a reverse mortgage as a backup a reasonable move?
Okay, reverse mortgages are very interesting options to have. They allow the borrower to access a significant fraction, in some cases, a significant fraction of the value of their home and turn it into spendable resources. So that's good. The issue is that the size of the reverse mortgage is limited, and that if you're living in, well, it doesn't matter where you're living. If the home value is $800,000, then you can get half out. If it's $2 million, you can only get $400,000 or $500,000 out, and that's going to be 20 or 25%. So the value or the utility of that reverse mortgage to you is going to depend on the size of the home value and how much of the home value you need to access to make your plan work. So if the limit, and I don't know off the top of my head exactly what the limit is, but it's under $600,000, and it's easy to find out. Reverse mortgages are called HECMs, HECM, and so you could look up HECM limit and know very quickly what the maximum is. So if that amount will work for you, then the answer is yes, that the reverse mortgage will be effective. But if the number is too small, then you'll need some other approach.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the questions. Really wonderful. And thanks for joining us today. This was the fourth of the four-part webinar series. When can I retire and what's my number? That doesn't mean that if you happen to have missed one of the earlier webinars, you're out of luck, not at all. Or if you'd like to go back and listen again for something to clarify something, You can go to the Sensible Financial website. Thanks so much for joining us. And Rick, your last thoughts?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with everyone. And best of luck to all in planning a safe and comfortable retirement.